The moment Grace stepped into the ballroom, a wealthy woman held out her wine glass and barked, "Red wine, no ice." "Hurry up!" When Grace smiled and politely declined, the woman sneered, "Then move along. You're making this place look cheap." Minutes later, another woman deliberately splashed champagne in her face and sneered, "I used to be his wife. You're just the bargain bin replacement." But the entire room fell silent when the billionaire, her husband, stepped onto the main stage, took Grace's hand and said boldly, "This event belongs to her. And you're nothing but trash." Grace stood there in the glittering chaos of the Manhattan Hotel ballroom, her plain ivory gown catching the soft glow of chandeliers. Her hair was pulled back low, no fuss, no curls, just a simple tie holding it together. She wore no makeup save a touch of gloss that barely showed. On her wrist, a thin silver bracelet worn smooth from years of wear glinted faintly. She wasn't trying to stand out, but eyes found her anyway, not because she sparkled, but because she didn't. She stood in a quiet corner, hands clasped loosely, watching the crowd swirl around her. Politicians shook hands, celebrities posed for cameras, and business tycoons clinked glasses, all under the banner of the Hartwell Foundation's charity gala. The theme was uplifting the future. Scholarships for young women, and the room buzzed with self-congratulation. Nobody knew Grace was the one who'd made it all possible. Nobody cared to ask. That first woman, the one with the wine glass, was decked out in a ruby-red dress that screamed money. Her name was Evelyn Carver, a hedge fund wife with diamonds dripping from her ears. She barely looked at Grace when she thrust the glass forward, her manicured nails clicking impatiently. When Grace said, "I'm not one of the servers," her voice was soft but clear. Evelyn's face twisted like she'd bitten something sour. "Then move," she snapped, waving her hand like she was shooing a stray dog. "People like you lower the class of this place." A couple nearby chuckled, their eyes flicking over Grace's gown, her lack of jewelry, her quiet stance. Grace didn't flinch. She stepped aside, her movement smooth, and found another corner. Her fingers brushed the bracelet on her wrist, a small grounding gesture, and she kept watching the room. As Grace settled into her new spot, a middle-aged man in a tailored tuxedo, his cufflinks gleaming with gold, approached with a condescending smile. His name tag read Charles Whitmore, a real estate mogul known for his flashy penthouse parties. He leaned in his breath, heavy with bourbon, and said, "Sweetheart, the coat check is that way. You're blocking the view." The people around him snickered, their eyes glinting with amusement. Grace looked at him, her gaze steady, and said, "I'm a guest here." Charles laughed loud and mocking, drawing more attention. "A guest? In that dress? You must have won a raffle ticket." The crowd's laughter grew sharp and cruel. Grace's fingers paused on her bracelet, her lips pressing into a thin line, but she didn't move. Her silence was a wall unyielding against his scorn. The gala was in full swing now, waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne and tiny appetizers. Nobody ate. Grace stayed out of the way, her eyes tracking the flow of people. She noticed a young woman, maybe 19, in a borrowed dress, standing nervously near the scholarship display. Grace's lips curved slightly, a private smile. That girl was one of the recipients, a kid from the Bronx who'd gotten a full ride to college because of the fund Grace had started. Nobody here knew that. They didn't need to. Grace's gaze lingered on the girl a moment longer, then shifted back to the crowd, steady and calm. A young socialite in a shimmering gold gown, her name tag reading Lila Prescott, strutted past Grace, her entourage trailing like a flock of glittering birds. Lila stopped, her eyes narrowing as she scanned Grace's plain gown. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "Did you borrow that from your mom's closet?" "This is a gala, not a funeral." Her friends burst into giggles, one snapping a photo with her phone, the flash blinding. Lila leaned closer, her perfume overwhelming. "Maybe next time try a little harder. You're embarrassing yourself." Grace's hand tightened briefly on her clutch, her knuckles pale, but her face stayed calm. She looked at Lila, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "I'm here for the cause," she said, her voice low but firm. Lila rolled her eyes, tossing her hair, and walked away, her laughter echoing. Grace's silence lingered heavier than their taunts. Near the grand staircase, a group of young men in sleek suits, their hair gelled to perfection, lounged with cocktails in hand. One, a venture capitalist named Trevor Langston, spotted Grace and nudged his friend. "Check out the wallflower," he said, loud enough for her to hear. "Bet she's here to clean up after us." His friends roared with laughter, one spilling his drink. Trevor kept going, his voice mocking. Hey, miss the mops in the back. Don't trip over that sad dress. Grace stood by a pillar, her hands clasped, her eyes fixed on a distant chandelier. She didn't turn, but her fingers brushed her bracelet, the metal cool against her skin. The events about the students, she said, her voice soft but clear. Trevor's grin faltered, his friend's laughter dying out, but he waved her off, turning back to his drink. Hey, hold on a sec. Can you do me a favor? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like Grace's hit hard, and your support keeps us telling them. It means a lot. All right, let's keep going. That's when Paul, the event director, pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with urgency. He stopped in front of Grace, his clipboard trembling in his hands. Madam Hartwell, he said, his voice loud enough to cut through the nearby chatter. We've reserved a seat for you at the head table. My apologies for the oversight. The socialites nearby froze, their champagne flutes hovering midair. Lila's smile vanished, her phone slipping slightly in her hand. Trevor's cocktail glass paused at his lips, his eyes narrowing. Grace looked at Paul, her expression soft but unyielding. I'm fine here, she said, her voice steady. I like the view. Paul nodded, almost bowing, and hurried off, his footsteps quick. The crowd around her shifted, their whispers now tinged with confusion, their eyes darting between Grace and the empty head table seat. The room felt colder now, the air heavy with whispers. Grace moved toward the scholarship display, her steps quiet, her gown swaying softly. She paused by a framed photo of last year's recipients, girls smiling wide in caps and gowns. Her fingers hovered near the frame, not touching, just tracing the air above it. A man in a tuxedo bumped into her, his elbow jostling her arm. Watch it, he muttered, not looking back. Grace stepped aside, her face still calm, her eyes flicking to the man's retreating back. She didn't say a word. She never did unless she had to. A group of older women, their furs and jewels gleaming, stood near the auction table, their voices carrying across the room. One, a silver-haired matriarch named Margaret Hensley, pointed at Grace with a gloved hand. Who is that girl? She said, loud enough for heads to turn. She's standing there like she's waiting for scraps. Doesn't she know this is an exclusive event? Her companions nodded, their lips pursed. Probably some intern who snuck in, another said, her diamond necklace flashing. Margaret laughed, her voice sharp. Someone should tell her to leave before she embarrasses herself further. Grace overheard every word, her fingers brushing the edge of the scholarship display. She didn't look their way, just adjusted a pamphlet on the table, her movements precise. Her silence was a shield unbowed by their venom. As the music swelled, a celebrity chef named Antonia Reyes, her sequined dress catching every light, strutted toward Grace, a smirk playing on her lips. She held a tray of hors d'oeuvres snatched from a passing waiter and stopped in front of Grace. Here, take one, she said, her voice loud and mocking. You look like you haven't eaten in days. The crowd nearby chuckled, their eyes glinting with amusement. Antonia tilted the tray, letting a shrimp roll fall to the floor at Grace's feet. Oops, clumsy me, she said, her laugh sharp. Grace looked down at the food, then back at Antonia, her gaze steady. I'm not hungry, she said, her voice calm but firm. Antonia's smirk faded her tray, lowering slightly, but she turned away, tossing her hair, her laughter echoing through the room. That's when a soft-spoken man in a simple suit, his name tag reading Dr. Samuel Ortiz, approached Grace, his eyes warm with recognition. He was a university dean, one of the scholarship program's advisors. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, his voice clear despite the crowd's noise. The girls you funded are here tonight. They asked me to thank you for their futures. The women at the auction table went silent, Margaret's glove slipping from her hand. Grace looked at Samuel, her expression softening. They earned it, she said, her voice steady. Samuel nodded, his smile genuine, and stepped back. The crowd's whispers shifted, their scorn replaced by curiosity. That's when Veronica Lane swept in her presence like a spotlight cutting through the crowd. Alexander Hartwell's ex-wife was impossible to miss. Tall, glamorous, her emerald gown sparkling with every step. Her dark hair cascaded in perfect waves, and her smile was all teeth, bright and predatory. The room seemed to tilt toward her, conversations, pausing, cameras clicking. Veronica's eyes locked onto Grace, and her smile sharpened. She grabbed a flute of champagne from a passing tray and sauntered over, her heels clicking like a countdown. Well, Veronica said, stopping just close enough to make Grace step back. You must be the new Mrs. Hartwell. Her voice was loud, dripping with mock sweetness. A few guests nearby turned their faces curious. Grace met Veronica's gaze, her expression steady. "I'm Grace," she said, her voice soft but firm. Veronica's laugh was sharp like a shard of glass. "Grace," she repeated, drawing out the name. "How quaint." She raised her champagne flute, pretending to toast, then tilted it just enough to send a cascade of golden liquid splashing across Grace's face and gown. The room gasped, then fell silent. Champagne dripped from Grace's hair, soaking into the ivory silk. Her glasses fogged slightly, but she didn't move to wipe them. Veronica smirked, her voice carrying. "Oops." My hand slipped. A few guests chuckled, their laughter nervous but cruel. "I used to sit where you are now," Veronica added, leaning in. "Enjoy it while it lasts." Grace stood there, her face unreadable, her hands still at her sides. She reached up, slowly removing her glasses, and cleaned them with the edge of her gown. Then she looked at Veronica, her eyes clear and unflinching. "You're making a scene," she said, her voice low, almost gentle. The words landed like a slap. Veronica's smirk faltered just for a second. During a break in this program, a group of corporate wives gathered near the dessert table, their voices carrying over the soft jazz. One, a woman named Cynthia Drake, in a sapphire gown, pointed at Grace and laughed. "Look at her still standing there like a drowned rat," she said, her voice sharp. "Doesn't she have any self-respect? I'd have left by now." Her friends nodded, their earrings glinting. "She's probably too poor to afford a cab," another said, her voice dripping with scorn. Cynthia kept going, her smile cruel. "Bet she's just here for the free food." Grace stood by a window, her gaze on the city lights below her, hands clasped tightly. She didn't turn, but her shoulders stiffened slightly, her bracelet catching the light. Her silence was a quiet defiance, unyielding against their cruelty. A young waiter, barely out of his teens, hurried over with a towel, his hands shaking. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," he stammered, offering it to her. Grace took it, her fingers brushing his, and said, "Thank you, Daniel." She'd noticed his name tag earlier, a small detail nobody else cared about. The boy's face lit up, his shoulders relaxing, and he scurried back to his post. Grace dabbed at her face, her movements calm, her eyes scanning the room. The crowd was still watching, their murmurs growing louder. A woman in a sapphire gown whispered to her husband, "Did she just call Veronica out?" Her husband shook his head, his eyes wide. Grace didn't react. She folded the towel neatly, set it on a nearby table, and stood straight, her gown clinging to her skin. That's when Clara Nguyen, the fashion journalist, pushed through the crowd, her press badge glinting under the lights. She stopped in front of Grace, her notebook already open. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, her voice firm but respectful. "Our research shows you're the anonymous donor behind the Silent Wings scholarship. Every girl here tonight owes her future to you. Can I get a statement?" The room went quiet, the air heavy with shock. Margaret Hensley's glove slipped from her hand, landing softly on the floor. Cynthia's laugh died in her throat, her dessert fork clattering against her plate. Grace looked at Clara, her head tilting slightly. "The girls are the story," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Not me." Clara nodded, scribbling furiously, and stepped back. The crowd's whispers were different now, tinged with awe. Veronica wasn't done. She turned to the crowd, her voice rising. "Can you believe this?" she said, gesturing toward Grace. "She used to live in a rundown rental in Brooklyn. I mean, really, Alex. This is who you pick." A few guests snickered, their eyes darting between Veronica and Grace. An older man in a pinstripe suit leaned toward his companion, muttering, "She doesn't even look like she belongs here." Grace heard it all. Her hands paused on the towel, her fingers tightening briefly. She didn't look up, just folded the towel neatly and set it on the table. Her bracelet caught the light, a quiet shimmer in the chaos. During the silent auction, a young tech entrepreneur named Ethan Caldwell, his hair slicked back and his watch screaming, Rolex, sidled up to Grace as she studied a painting up for bid. "Hey, you look lost," he said, his voice loud enough to draw eyes. "This isn't the staff break room." His friends nearby laughed, their martini glasses clinking. Ethan leaned closer, his smirk wide. "Maybe stick to the kitchen next time." "Yeah." Grace's fingers paused on her clutch, her eyes flicking to the painting, a portrait of a young woman reading her face lit by candlelight. "I like this piece," she said, her voice calm. "It reminds me of resilience." Ethan snorted, shaking his head. "Whatever, lady. You're out of your depth." Grace didn't respond. just stepped away, her silence cutting deeper than his words. That's when a quiet older woman, her gray hair pinned elegantly, approached Grace, her name tag reading Dr. Helen Voss, a renowned philanthropist. She stopped beside the painting, her eyes on Grace. "You're the one who outbid everyone for this last year," she said, her voice low but clear. "I checked the records. You donated it back to the foundation for tonight's auction." The crowd nearby went silent, Ethan's smirk fading. Grace looked at Helen, her expression soft. "It belongs here," she said, her voice steady. Helen nodded, her eyes warm, and walked away. Ethan's friends turned away, their laughter gone, leaving him standing alone. As the auction continued, a fashion influencer named Brooke Tanner, her phone perpetually in hand, stood near Grace, live streaming to her thousands of followers. "Guys, check out this chick," she said, angling her camera toward Grace. "She's like totally out of place. That dress, tragic." Her followers flooded the chat with laughing emojis, their comments popping up in real time. Brooke kept going, her voice loud and mocking. "Bet she's never even heard of Gucci. Should we start a GoFundMe for her wardrobe?" The crowd nearby chuckled, their eyes glinting with amusement. Grace stood by a display of auction items. Her hands clasped, her gaze on a small sculpture of a bird in flight. She didn't turn, but her fingers tightened briefly, her bracelet pressing into her skin. "The sculpture's beautiful," she said, her voice soft but clear. Brooke's stream stuttered, her followers' comments slowing. That's when a museum curator named Evelyn Chen, her glasses perched on her nose, approached Grace, her voice cutting through Brooke's chatter. "Mrs. Hartwell, your donation of this sculpture last year saved our exhibit," she said, her voice firm. "It's the centerpiece of our new wing, thanks to you." The crowd went quiet, Brooke's phone lowering slightly, her stream going silent. Grace looked at Evelyn, her expression calm. "Art should be shared," she said, her voice steady. Evelyn nodded, her smile warm, and walked away. Brooke's followers turned on her, their comments now praising Grace, leaving Brooke flustered and alone. Grace moved back to her corner, her steps unhurried. The crowd parted slightly, their eyes following her. She stopped by the scholarship display again, her gaze lingering on the young woman from the Bronx. The girl was talking to a mentor now, her face lit up with hope. Grace's lips curved again, that private smile returning. She reached out, adjusting a flower in a vase nearby, her movements precise. The room was still watching, but she didn't care. She never had. A group of young influencers, their phones constantly flashing, gathered near the photo booth, their voices loud and mocking. One, a woman in a neon pink dress named Sydney Harper, pointed at Grace and laughed. "Look at her standing there like a wet dog. That dress is ruined. She should just leave." Her friends giggled, one filming Grace with her phone, zooming in on the damp gown. Sydney kept going, her voice sharp. "Bet she's some nobody trying to crash the party. Pathetic." Grace's hand paused on the vase, her fingers tightening briefly. She didn't look at them, just smoothed the flower's petals, her movements deliberate. "The event's for the girls," she said, her voice low but clear, carrying across the room. Sydney's laughter stopped, her phone lowering slightly. That's when Alexander Hartwell stepped into the room. He was impossible to miss, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark suit tailored to perfection. His presence shifted the air, conversations faltering, cameras turning. He was the CEO of Hartwell Global, the man behind the foundation, and the reason every guest was here. His face was calm, but his eyes were locked on Grace. He crossed the room in long, steady strides, ignoring the hands reaching out to greet him. When he reached her, he stopped, his gaze softening. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, pristine white, and gently dabbed at the champagne still clinging to her face. The room held its breath. Alexander didn't say a word at first. He knelt right there in front of everyone and took Grace's hand. His lips brushed her knuckles, a gesture so intimate it felt like the crowd shouldn't be watching. "No one has the right to touch you," he said, his voice low but clear, carrying across the silent room. "You are the only woman I've ever chosen forever." Grace looked down at him, her eyes steady, her hand resting lightly in his. She didn't smile, didn't blush, didn't falter. She just stood there, her presence as powerful as his. The crowd was frozen, their earlier laughter a distant memory. During the dinner service, a prominent banker named Roger Langley, his tie loose and his face flushed from wine, stood up at his table and pointed at Grace. "Why is she still here?" He slurred, his voice booming across the room. "She's a nobody. Get her out before she ruins the vibe." The guests nearby laughed, their forks clinking against plates. Roger kept going, his grin wide. What, you think you're one of us? Go back to wherever you came from. Grace sat at her table, her napkin folded neatly in her lap, her eyes locked on her plate. She didn't respond, just picked up her water glass, her fingers steady. Her silence was louder than his drunken taunts, a quiet rebuke that left the room uneasy. That's when the MC, a polished man named James Carter, took the stage, his voice cutting through the tension. Before we continue, I'd like to acknowledge the woman who made this gala possible. He set his eyes on Grace. Grace Walker, the honorary chair of the Hartwell Foundation, personally funded every scholarship awarded tonight. The room went silent, Roger's glass slipping from his hand, shattering on the floor. Grace looked up, her expression calm, and nodded once at James. The applause that followed was thunderous, drowning out the earlier jeers. As the dinner plates were cleared, a society matron named Vivian Holt, her pearls gleaming under the lights, leaned toward her table mates, her voice carrying across the room. That woman's a fraud, she said, pointing at Grace. She's probably some gold digger who tricked Alex into marriage. Look at her, nothing special. Her companions nodded, their laughter sharp and cruel. Vivian kept going, her voice rising. She's got no class, no pedigree. She's a disgrace to this event. Grace stood by a window. Her hands clasped, her gaze on the city lights below. She didn't turn, but her fingers tightened on her bracelet, her knuckles pale. The scholarships are for the girl's future, she said softly, her voice cutting through Vivian's tirade. The room quieted, Vivian's pearls clinking as she sat back. Her face flushed. That's when a young scholarship recipient, a girl named Aisha Carter, approached Grace, her borrowed dress shimmering nervously. Miss Walker, she said, her voice trembling but clear. I'm one of your scholars. My mom's here tonight. She said you paid for my tuition when we lost everything. I just wanted to thank you. The room went silent, Vivian's fork falling to her plate with a soft clink. Grace looked at Aisha, her eyes softening, her smile warm. You're the reason I'm here, she said, her voice steady. Aisha nodded, tears in her eyes, and stepped back into the crowd. The applause that followed was heartfelt, a quiet rebuke to Vivian's scorn. Alexander stood, his hand still holding Grace's hand, and led her toward the stage. The MC handed him the microphone without a word. Alexander stepped into the spotlight, his presence commanding, but his eyes never left Grace. Tonight's gala belongs to Grace Walker, he said, his voice steady, each word deliberate. She's not just my wife. She's the honorary chair of the Hartwell Foundation. The room erupted in applause, the sound almost desperate, like they were trying to erase their earlier cruelty. Grace stood beside him, her gown still damp, her hair still clinging to her neck. She didn't wave, didn't smile. She just looked out at the crowd, her eyes calm and unflinching. The applause died down, and Alexander stepped back, his hand resting lightly on Grace's arm. The MC announced the scholarship recipients, and the young woman from the Bronx stepped forward, her borrowed dress shimmering under the lights. Grace's eyes followed her, her fingers brushing her bracelet, a quiet gesture of pride. The girl gave a short speech, her voice cracking with gratitude, and the crowd clapped again, softer this time, more genuine. Grace didn't move, but her smile was a beacon of hope. Veronica was nowhere to be seen now. She'd slipped out during Alexander's speech, her emerald gown trailing behind her like a defeated flag. The next morning, a press release from Hartwell Global announced that Veronica Lane had been stripped of all rights to use the Hartwell name. Her social media accounts vanished, her carefully curated image shattered overnight. A gossip column screamed Veronica Lane's champagne fiasco exiled from Hartwell's world. The comments were merciless, thousands piling on her cruelty. She stayed silent, her empire crumbling. Evelyn Carver's world imploded quietly. Her husband's name was erased from the Hartwell Foundation's donor list. Weeks later, a financial report revealed his firm lost Hartwell Global as a client, a blow that sent his stock tumbling. Evelyn's invitations to elite events dried up, her name whispered with pity. She was seen at a diner, her diamonds gone, her face hollow, staring into a cold coffee. Nobody approached her. The women who'd mocked Grace's gown faced their own reckoning. Clara Nguyen's Vogue piece. The quiet power of Grace. Walker didn't name them, but the world knew. It exploded online, shared millions of times with comments hailing Grace's grace and torching the elitists who'd sneered. The pearl-clad woman lost her luxury brand deal, her contract canceled overnight. Another was ousted from her charity committee, her reputation in ruins. The headline hit days later. The woman drenched in champagne owns the gala. It dominated newsstand social media talk shows. The photo captured Grace beside Alexander, her wet gown clinging her eyes, fierce yet calm. Clara Nguyen's quote went viral. Grace Walker didn't need to shout. Her presence spoke volumes. Memes of Grace's steady gaze flooded the internet, hashtags like Grace Walker and Silent Strength trending globally. Grace didn't read the headlines. She didn't scroll through the comments. That night after the gala, she stood with Alexander on the hotel rooftop, the city sprawling below. Her hair was still damp, her gown heavy, but she stood unwavering, eyes on the horizon. Alexander's jacket draped over her shoulders, his hand warm on hers. The city lights shimmered, a silent vow of resilience. "I don't need to scream to prove my worth," Grace said, her voice soft but piercing like a star cutting through the night. "I just need to show up." Alexander's gaze held hers, his grip firm, no words needed. Her bracelet gleamed in the moonlight, a quiet testament. She was enough, always had been. Her strength was their story too, for everyone dismissed, judged, silenced. For those who'd pressed on, quiet but unshakable. Her truth was a beacon, steady and true, for anyone who'd felt invisible. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.